Let's just say in terms of organization, I want to follow standard economist rules, which means interrupt whenever you want. The important thing is that there will be times when I talk too fast. I will make mistakes, and sometimes I won't be clear. So by all means, ask questions. So as I said, what I want to do in this lecture is talk about three things. First is the measurement of intergenerational mobility. The second is something about the theory. And third, I want to say something about normative implications. So let me also say that the probability I get through everything I put on slides is, I don't want to say it is zero, but it's probably close to zero. And so rather than talk too fast, even faster than I normally talk, I will simply talk at my normal pace, and whatever isn't finished will be in the slides, and hopefully these slides will be reasonably comprehensive. All right. So the first question is how to think about intergenerational mobility. And that's a very complicated object if you reflect on it for a second. And what I mean by that is that at some level, what intergenerational mobility is asking is how do we construct conditional probabilities. So I'm going to use mu for conditional probabilities. And what I want to say is that there's some set of outcomes for offspring, so YIO, that depends on things about the parents. So in other words, if I'm describing intergenerational mobility, what I do is I measure some characteristics of the parents. It could be education, it could be income, it could be occupation, and then I describe probabilistically what's going on with the kids. Now, that's actually a very complicated object. You might say, well, I did probability theory. I know how to work with conditional probabilities. As a piece of mathematics, it may be straightforward. As a piece of measurement, it's very complicated because it is a function. And so if I asked you to compare intergenerational mobility in the United States and Russia, how would you think about that? Would you construct two conditional probabilities? And if I said you compare them, well, that's not so obvious. How do you compare functions? And so the serious point, of course, is that in thinking about mobility, social scientists don't focus on overall conditional probabilities. They focus on statistics that are associated with intergenerational mobility, with this complicated thing called a conditional probability. Most of the literature, in fact, is linear and focuses on a particular relationship, and that is called the intergenerational elasticity of income. And so the way to understand that is that one starts with pairs of individuals. Think of this as a family, so it's going to be an individual, a person and their offspring. And basically the calculation is to take the relationship between the parents and the kids as being linear. I might put some control variables in, but the key variable is going to be this object here. In other words, the thought experiment is I know the logarithm of the parent's income, and I want to ask, what is the change in the conditional expectation of the child's log income given a 1% change in the parent's income? And that is what this rho term gives you. That's called the intergenerational elasticity of income. All right. And so that can be, I could call that the coefficient that launched 1,000 ships, because there are so many papers that in essence run regressions of this form. Now, there's a couple of things I want you to notice here. The first is that in thinking about a problem like this, we normally would want to think about some additional control variables, and we need to respect the presence of unobserved heterogeneity. Now, an example of the sort of control variable you'd need to think about is the age of the parent and the child. After all, I just said parents and children. Am I comparing 27-year-old children to 50-year-old parents? Or am I comparing 50 and 50? And so that's part of the things you'd have to do to adjust the relationship. But you can see what the intuition is in generating this is you reduce down the conditional probability structure to a linear relationship, and lo and behold, you have a statistic to measure mobility. So let me make a couple of comments before I talk about the details of these types of calculations. And the first comment is that the intergenerational mobility literature is very largely, it's generated by studies in Britain and the United States. Okay. Now, that shouldn't surprise you, since I'll say the largest economies tend to be where the center of gravity is for economic research. But there's an extremely important implication for that. And that is that the tools that have been developed are specific, or at least have a background whose logic applies to Britain and the United States. Everybody with me on that? Now, why would I want to draw that contrast? Suppose I wanted to think about measuring intergenerational mobility in Russia or in China. Think about the thought experiment, right? I have data in the United States since over the last 70 years, and I can form pairs of parents and children. I can run these types of regressions. I get a coefficient. I could do the same thing for Russia, and I could do the same thing for China. The exercise might make sense to the United States because it may be a newer country than the other two, but it's an old economy. It's near its steady state. Would it make any sense to do the same thing for Russia? Would it make sense to pair parents who spent most of their educational time before 1991 with children who spend their occupational time after 1991? Does it make sense to compare parents in China pre-reform to children who function in a post-reform environment? Does everyone see where I'm going with that? Implicit in writing down a statistical model are substantive assumptions about the societies. In the case of Russia, to compare pre and post 91, to me, is close to a non-starter, because you're asking about comparisons of the socioeconomic status of adults in a non-market economy with offspring who were not just in a market economy, they were in a economy in revolution and complete transformation from socialism to capitalism. Similarly, if you're comparing Chinese data, what does it mean to compare parents who the measurements come from pre-reform versus an economy that's growing 10% a year? All right, and so I want to just sensitize you to that even the simplest statistical models have embedded in them substantive assumptions. And in my judgment, it is a challenge to ask what the right measures are for thinking about mobility in qualitatively transforming economies. So in the discussion, I'm going to nevertheless work with the standard model, and I'm going to set x equal to 0, because I don't want to worry about details that are going to, which we would implement in empirical work, which are going to move away from the empirical literature. All right, is everybody with me? So let me make two more comments. The final comment is, one has to be very careful in thinking about any statistic, because it's a single statistic that moves away from a much more complicated description of mobility. All right, and so that's why I emphasize that the underlying thing of interest would ultimately be a conditional probability. Whereas at the end of the day, you have to, you're going to end up with dimension reductions, and that can be substantive. The second thing I wanted to mention is that you need to think about, in the back of your minds, the heterogeneity of the populations under study. What do I mean by that? I'm going to talk about numbers where the United States looks quite unfavorable compared to other very wealthy countries, obviously in Central and Western Europe, with respect to intergenerational mobility.
Can I ask one question?
Please.
Yeah. So, so when you think about transition economy, like when you think about the IGE in transition economy, what kind of aspects you will think about by doing calculation for those countries?
Well, I don't have an answer to that. Something I'm currently thinking about, but here's the point I would make for China. All right, let's take these two numbers. There's been a lot of attention to the fact that the intergenerational elasticity of incomes seems to have gone up, for the sake of argument, from 0.3 to 0.4. I think if you're going to judge that, you need to account for the fact that alpha doubled. In other words, if I have an economy that moves into 10% a year growth, I interpret changes in mobility very differently than if the growth is stationary. So part of the answer in my mind is that one needs to have measures that respect both changes in growth as well as changes in relative status. I mean, another way to see what the issue is going to be is this. Suppose the transition function from parents to kids is phi, and we have a nice steady state there. Once the families have achieved the steady state, there's no growth. Along here, there's going to be a different relationship between parents and kids, but that's all transitional. And so I don't have, as I said, this is something I'm actively thinking about, but I don't have a clean answer for it. I think the Chinese case, and I should say the Russian cases, there's something to distinguish there. And as the Chinese case, the issue in the transition is against a background of rapid transition towards a private sector economy. The Russian case that I gave you was actually trying to compare non-market and market inequalities. And that's I think an even more difficult problem. So if you sort of said, what is the intergenerational elasticity that one sees in different countries, as I gave a hint to that, and that is if you did it for Western Europe, we would find lower numbers in the United States. But even within the United States, what one would find is kind of a first order statement is that this number has changed over time. In other words, if you look in the 1970s, the best estimates of the intergenerational elasticity were around 0.2. Current estimates can be as high as 0.6, 0.65. One question to ask is that quantitatively significant? Think about it this way. If I take 0.2 and I cube it, I get 0.008. If I cube 0.6, I get a very different number. Where I get 0.216. That says that if you look at the persistence of status across 3 generations, they're very, very different. So it's a big deal whether or not it's 0.2 or 0.6. So that leads us to the question, why would it be that if I'm studying American data, that one finds a qualitative change in the intergenerational elasticity? And this is the point on measurement. The answer is generally regarded as not a statement that America has become less mobile across time. It's to a greater, there's a little bit of evidence that that's true, but that's weak. It's nothing like these numbers here. And this is the first message I wanted to give you. Second message on measurement. First message was there's this complicated thing which is called conditional probabilities. Lots of different dimensions to it. Measurement typically reduces the conditional probabilities to scalars, to numbers, statistics that you can report, and there can be information losses there. Now, turning to the most conventional dimension reduction, we have this linear object, and we, of course, know it's straightforward to analyze linear systems. And we have a fact now that if you analyze American data, you see this very large changes in mobility, at least the estimates across time. And what I want to put on the table is this actually reveals what is the fundamental measurement issue with respect to intergenerational mobility. And it turns out that the best explanation of why the best estimates have increased so much is not something changed in the US. The quality of the data went up. In other words, it was quote unquote better data sets that led to these more persistent estimates. So now the question is, why would that be true? And that leads to the first theoretical idea. And that is that it's conventional to think about income as having a decomposition. So if I'm talking about the income of a parent or the income of a child, I decompose the income into something called permanent income and something called transitory income. Okay, these are identities. And the trick is to try to do the decomposition. So what's the difference between permanent and transitory income? Many of you will have already learned that from basic macroeconomics. When you learn the theory of the consumption function, one of the key distinctions is permanent versus transitory income. One way to think about it, okay, a classic way, is that suppose that my income this year is $100,000. Everybody with me? And so and it turns out my income has 2 parts. I have a salary of $80,000 and I won a lottery of $20,000. Well, my salary is permanent. My income, my lottery victory is transitory because of the lack of persistence in transitory income. Okay, so that's the key idea. In other words, we think the parents, individuals have some lifetime earning capacity. That's kind of their fundamental determinants of income. But every year there's some fluctuations around it, which as a first order you can think of as luck. Or think about it this way, that what controls, at least for most people, their lifetime earnings, again, as a first order, as an approximation, could be their educational levels. And what they get paid every year has something to do with their success in matching in labor markets, and some heterogeneity in inflation, et cetera. But the general idea is we think about individual incomes every year as having a underlying permanent component and then some transitory parts. Please, Francisco.
Yeah, I just want to know if the transitory part of the parent income must be in log term, or if I am missing something.
Well, it doesn't have to be in log terms. I'm writing it this way because the equation is based on logarithms. But there's a smaller literature that worries about whether to think about these things in levels and logs. I'm going to go with the convention. I don't think there's any principled reason to do one versus the other.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, the problem with doing levels is unless you let the variance increase, then as you have secular economic growth, the transitory parts would disappear.
Professor, the way it's written, the second term should have log, right? The first equation.
Yes, that's called a typo. Thank you. Yes, that should say log. All right, so why is that going to be important? Let's go back to the example I gave before. And that is that if you asked what it is I do for my kids in order to transmit my socioeconomic status to them, well, you could say there's lots of things. Clearly, my permanent income has a much more important effect on my ability to invest in them. After all, that's going to have to do with my lifetime earning capacity and therefore my lifetime capability of influencing their human capital. If I went to non-investment theories of the relationship between parents and kids, you might think that kind of my abilities, genotypic or not, they get transmitted to my kids in a different way than my luck gets transmitted. There's no reason to think my children become more likely to win lotteries if I win one, but you might think that my ability to earn a high salary is for reasons that are associated with things that my children will have as well. All right, notice this is purely a statistical relationship. There's no theory here as to why the incomes correlate, but the idea is simply that the permanent parts are the things that correlate and the transitory do not. What that means, in other words, is that the logic in thinking about the measurement of intergenerational mobility comes down to working with environments in which the assumption is that the underlying functional relationship between parent and offspring income is generated via permanent income. Once you think about it that way, if this is the correct relationship, then this is a misspecified relationship. Okay, and that actually gives us the theory of intergenerational mobility measurement. If this is the actual relation, then what you would say is that if I run this regression, everybody with me? I need to write it in terms of, to understand the properties of beta, I need to account for the fact that I have mismeasured objects here. In other words, I rearrange the system. And if it's the case that permanent income obeys that relationship, then actual income obeys this. It's going to be this plus a complicated error that reflects the fact that we haven't measured things in terms of permanent income, we've measured it in terms of transitory income. All I did was I took the original permanent income relationship and I manipulated it to move it from permanent income to realized income. All right. So now let's just stare at this for a second, or look at it, and think about it. Okay, the data give me, I have that from the data, I have that from the data, and now I have a complicated error. In particular, this error does not have quote unquote nice properties. What's the nice property we want in any regression? The errors are orthogonal to the regressors. However, measured income is correlated with transitory income. All right, and so we have the standard measurement error formula. In other words, if I project income against income, I will have the behavioral relationship, that was the permanent income relationship, multiplied by the ratio of the variance of permanent income to the sum of permanent and transitory income. Okay, that's the classic measurement error formula, which tells you that when you mismeasure a regressor in a bivariate regression, what happens? You lower the informational content of the regressor, and so the regression coefficient is pushed towards the origin and magnitude. So I went very quickly, but the thought logic is we think the true relationship is between permanent incomes. We don't measure permanent income. There's not a database called permanent income. There's a database called income. When I project parental income against or offspring income against parental income, I'm getting biased estimates of the relationship between the permanent incomes. The magnitude of that bias depends on the ratio of the variance of the signal to the variance of the signal plus the variance of the noise. All right, and so that pushes you towards the origin. Now, this is a formula you may very well have seen in introductory econometrics. But notice it's the keys to the kingdom. What it tells us is the greater the measurement error, the lower the estimate compared to the true value. And so that's what I meant when I said that in thinking about the history of estimates of intergenerational mobility, there's a statistical reason why the estimates have increased. And that is that better data sets have less measurement. All right. So what makes a data set better? Well, what makes a data set better in this case is something very simple. It's the length of the data set. So in other words, it's one thing to have 10 years of data on a parent, it's another to have 30. It's one thing to have 3 years of data on a child, it's better to have 15. And this is the point. The assumption in the literature is that the way that we measure permanent income is to take averages. Okay, so start off with identity that says that if I were to average incomes, there would be a permanent part and a transitory part. Okay, so in other words, I can think of the long run averages of those. But notice that under the assumption is the following, and that is that under the assumption there's a constant permanent income and all the fluctuations are transitory, the average of parental income equals the permanent income plus the average of the transitory income. All right, the assumption in our model of permanent and transitory is there was a constant object for each person called permanent plus a time indexed thing called transitory. So when you average all the incomes up of a parent, you preserve the signal, the permanent income, and that's going to be, and do I have typos here? Yes, I do. This should be a parent and that should be a parent, sorry. What I have are the permanent income of the parents and I have the average of the transitory. What happens is I average more and more pieces of transitory income. The variance of the average is scaling downwards for the obvious reason. So what's happening is I have longer epochs over which to average incomes. To extract permanent income, I have less measurement error. All right. So that's it. That's the basis of the literature. And that's why there has been this enormous interest in identifying longer data sets, why there's interest in getting tax data in the United States where you have many years for individuals, so on and so forth. Okay, it looks like an elementary point, but it's a big deal operationally. And so, one of the messages for you as graduate students is data may not be a glamorous exercise, but it's a fundamental exercise in understanding phenomena. And so I put, I can't emphasize enough that this ability to extract permanent and transitory is fundamental to these activities. All right, so what I want to do is one more thing, and that is I want to show you a transformation of the IgE regression, which will be useful in thinking. And that is that I could always interpret the change in income, the percentage change in income between parents and kids as alpha plus rho minus 1 log permanent plus epsilon. All I did was subtract the income of the parent off of both. All right. Now, why did I do this? What is this term here? That's the growth rate of income in the family between the parent and the child. So another interpretation of this regression is that it's actually calculating, if I do it in this form, the relationship between the initial income of a parent and the growth rate between parents and children. Now, why is this important? Well, if rho is less than 1, then rho minus 1 is negative. If rho is bigger than 1, it's positive, obviously. You've seen this regression in other contexts. That's the basis of the cross-country growth literature. In other words, when people study cross-country growth behavior, what do? They regress growth rates of countries against their initial incomes. And then we say that there's convergence if the coefficients less is negative. In other words, a negative association between initial income and growth, and there's divergence otherwise. It's exactly the same regression. And so that tells us that one of the things we will be interested in, is everybody with me, is whether that coefficient rho is bigger than 1 or less than 1. Okay. Now, I will tell you that every estimate I've ever seen of the IgE is less than 1. And so in that sense, all the IgEs that are estimated always say there will be convergence between rich and poor families. Now, you might say, wow, that's what fantastic news for people who worry about inequality. All family dynasties will converge. Well, if you believe the regression describes reality, that would be great news. This is the message I want you to have. These types of models cannot generate poverty traps in family dynasties, nor can they generate affluence traps. They are linear models. And linear models have very little scope to create permanent inequality. And that's another thing just to think about when you're doing empirical work, is whether the statistical models you're using are adequate to capture the phenomena you want. All right, are there any questions on that?
Can I ask you a question, please? It's not
Please.
related to exactly this point, but I was just wondering if there is any literature on which measures the effect of the social prestige of the parent over to children's income, the child's income.
The answer is yes in several dimensions. Okay, the one it's a great question. I would say that that's actually the place I would start is looking at sociology. Economists look at income. Sociologists traditionally have looked at occupation. All right, and so there's kind of a couple of ways you would think about occupation. One of them is class. The transition from, as the white collar parents have white collar kids, so on and so forth. The modern occupational literature has occupational indices, and many of them are prestige indices. Right. Now, prestige is as a concept, one has to think about what it means to measure it. And typically you'd want to have some combination of the educational requirements for the job and the income the job pays. And there's, and obviously those are things one has to think hard about. But I think that the occupational mobility literature is closest in spirit to what you're thinking about. And it's a very deep question you raised, which is why income is not the sufficient statistic for well-being or for what parents do for kids. There are literatures that study educational mobility, that study, as I said, occupational mobility takes pride of place. There's ones that look at phenomena such as crime. In other words, whether or not you have intergenerational persistence in the likelihood of engagement with the criminal justice system. There's yet other literatures, unsurprisingly, that look at health. And so I think a valid concern, again, but this is, these are opportunities for you as researchers, is to think about multivariate evolution of mobility. Okay, are there other questions on that?
I have a question about the interpretation of this one. If it's pretty similar to the conventional convergence theory, then as the parents are richer, the growth rate of income of the children or the offsprings is going to be lower, such that there is going to be a catch-up of the poorer generations. So this is what this will be implying in the same intuition. Okay.
Yes, and what I wanted to emphasize is that I've written quite a few papers on this if you're interested. Linear growth regressions make special assumptions about the relationships between countries, and they rule out poverty traps. They rule out affluence traps for being rich. The same thing is true, therefore, for IgE regressions. If your vision of a society is that really poor people, it's hard to for their kids to get out of poverty, and for rich people, they're able to lock their kids into wealth. That's a nonlinear vision. And the middle class moves around everywhere. That's a nonlinear model. Linearity is a very powerful assumption and beneficial one for data summaries, et cetera. But it is a lens through which there's certain things you just can't see.
And in terms of the linearity, a way to avoid these kind of drawbacks from linearity will be like to split the sample of population and just focus on, let's say, in the poorest family spheres and then the richest ones, and examine if this convergence exists in both of them.
Well, I think that there's many ways to estimate nonlinear models. So I was going to make a joke for a Russian audience that all linear models are the same, but every nonlinear model is nonlinear in its own way. And so the serious point is that you have to decide how you're going to structure the nonlinearity. What you wanted to do was to have a piecewise linear model, or in which you divide the data and it's all linear. I could have local linear models. I could actually build in from theory the nature of the nonlinearity, so on and so forth. I think a fair statement is non-parametric analyses or mechanical analyses of nonlinearity don't tend to find much evidence. The better evidence of nonlinearity has been theory-motivated search. In other words, this is the place to look.
Thanks.
One final comment, actually, I keep saying it's a final comment, is, and I mentioned this before, there's a tendency to ignore alpha. All the action is beta. If beta is high, you're persistent. If beta is low, it's not persistent. I think that's a problem, actually, because it misses certain types of lack of mobility. So let's take the United States. Suppose I was thinking about this regression, but my concern was not intergenerational mobility between individual parents and their kids, but I wanted to know about blacks and whites. Well, I might want to have a regression that had an AW and an alpha B and a rho W minus 1 and a rho B minus 1. In other words, I might be interested in the difference in the coefficients for both Black African Americans and whites. And if I was interested in conversions about blacks and whites, the action would be in the alphas. So in other words, the assumption that all of the mobility questions are in the betas, I think, is itself problematic, because it misses that certain types of inequalities manifest themselves in averages in the long run, not just in how the marginal sensitivity of parents to kids. All right. That cuts in more than one direction. In other words, I gave you an example where the US, if you don't think about it that way, you would end up with a misleading view of the lack of persistence of inequality by race. An example where doing this would make the US look extremely favorable is look at immigrants. So in other words, if I made this, if I make a claim, which is empirically true, that mobility appears to be much higher in Scandinavia than the United States, it's not clear that you would give the same answer if you asked about immigrants to Scandinavia versus the United States. Now, again, I was not trying to denigrate Scandinavia or anything. It's a statement that you'd have to think harder about what it means to talk about mobility when you're asking particular questions. All right. So that's what I wanted to say about measurement. And there's some discussion in the lecture notes about that. And so in the interest of time, let me turn to theory. So I don't think anybody here is going to be surprised if I said, you know, the socioeconomic status of parents is predictive of the socioeconomic status of kids. And then the question is, well, why would that happen? And I think that within economics, there's three types of explanations, and I'll say more, and then maybe a little more broadly in social science. And their respective roles of not, it's not known what the respective roles look like. And at this point, there's not an integrated model, as it were, that takes everything and puts them together. All right, and let me just from the chat, it's hard for me to monitor the chat in real time, so please feel free to ask questions. So what I want to say is that basically the following, that is that in understanding why the parents are predictive of their kids, there's really three, as I said, three ways to think about it, and I want to say something about each of them. Okay. The first set of models are what are called family income or family investment models. What those models do is they just develop a theory of parental investments in their kids. And they are the classic models of intergenerational mobility. Becker and Tomes would be one example, and Lowry is another example. And what they do is they focus basically on a decision problem that parents face. So the idea would be, in a model like this is really how you would just go about the logic. You think of them as overlapping generations models. And so you have a set of family dynasties, and the dynasties, every person lives 2 periods. So the timing is very crude. One period is called childhood, the other is called adulthood. All right. Now, the assumption is that people reproduce asexually. So in other words, the dynasties are evolving independently. As a fact about biology, that's not a good one. Now, the question here is not whether it's a silly assumption, whether it's a useful assumption. If you had marriage across family dynasties, what you'd have to then do is have a theory of the assortative matching of partners. In other words, the children of the rich marry each other or not. And those are complications you don't put into a model. For those of you that are interested in theory, I think it's a fair, my pedagogical statement to you is you write down the simplest model, capture your ideas, then you relax the assumptions and enrich it. If you start with the most general model, it's going to be very hard to make any progress. And so for these types of models, I think introducing intermarriage dynasties it's interesting, but it's not essential. Okay. So the way these parents work, these models are going to typically work is that the children are passive. Those of you that have children will laugh, but the assumption in the model is that's how it is. So in childhood, a child doesn't do anything except they receive investment from their parents. The parents make a choice of education or make a choice of investment, and that investment produces a certain quality of education. All right. And so there'll be some functional relationship that says, I invest in my child. That investment interacts with their ability. That's a latent variable in the system, and it produces a certain level of education. All right. What does education do? It produces income. And so the second assumption is going to be that if I know the education of an individual, there's a functional relationship between that education and their income as an adult. I'm going to write it in terms of education begets the logarithm of income, because I want to keep some similarity to the original model. And there's something called labor market luck. In other words, it's not a deterministic relationship. People are more or less lucky in what jobs they match to. If they're working in the Silicon Valley, there's an element of luck in who invents something first, so on and so forth. All right. I'm going to have a bunch of technical assumptions on the errors. I to sum them up. In the model that I'm going to talk about, the errors are all IID in every direction, because I don't want to worry about that type of heterogeneity because it leads to messier equations. Okay, so where's the action in a model like this? It's very elementary. It says that if I'm a parent, I have a certain income. I divide that income between the investments of my children and my consumption. That's it. Now, what's important is that I have to fulfill this as a budget constraint. In other words, I can't borrow money and to educate my children with the promise my children will pay the debt off. Okay, that's banned, that, in other words, the key in the model is that the parent's budget set is controlling the investment, the opportunities to invest in children. Okay, as a legal matter, it would be the rare, I'm not aware of any country in which, well, actually, that's not entirely true. It's extremely rare, and certainly in the West, it's actually illegal to try to get kids to pay their parents' debts. In other words, you cannot legally obligate your parents to pay your debts. So that's all the assumption is. In a more realistic demography, obviously, if people live more than 2 periods, there would be scope for children to borrow when they're in college and to then pay it back in their own lifetimes. The point is, this is an extreme form of saying that family resources limit investments in children. If you had more realistic models, you would have less of, the assumption could be less extreme, but the same principle would be there. And so that model is sufficient to generate a theory of intergenerational mobility. I'm not even going to tell you what the parent's utility functions are. I'm just saying the model I wrote is sufficient. How come? Whatever the utility function is of the parents, everybody with me? It doesn't matter how they optimize. Their choice of investment in their children will depend on 2 things. It will depend on their resources, the budget constraint, and will depend on their knowledge of the ability of their children. All right, maybe I care about my parent. Maybe I get intrinsic utility from educating my children. Maybe I get utility from the utility of my children. Maybe I get utility from the income of my children. In other words, the opportunity set they face. Whatever it is, there's the same answer. And that is, there will be a decision rule that maps my income, and the ability of my child. I may decide to invest more in a child with high ability. I may decide to invest less because I'll make a lot of money anyways. But whatever it is, there'll be a functional relationship. Okay, does that make sense? The nature of G will depend on my utility as a parent, but the fact of G doesn't. So, because, again, I've gone quickly, but think about what we put on the table. I put on the table this. Now, if I substitute in everything, at the end of the day, the income of a child depends on their labor market luck. It depends on the investment of their parents, their ability, and their human capital. So if you recursively substitute the 3 functions, F, E, and G, collectively produce dependence between parental income and offspring income. Does that make sense? Now, the nature of the relationship is going to depend on how sensitive the parents' investments are to the parents' income. That's G. It's going to depend on how sensitive education is to investment. That's E. And it's going to depend on how sensitive future income is to education. That's F. And so that all is just saying it verbally all makes sense. And that's what the functional relationship is. And so what this gives us is a relationship that says there is some function of unobserved heterogeneity and parental income that produces offspring income. All right. So that's it. That's the theoretical basis of family investment models. You will notice they do not produce linear models, except in very special cases. But that's the basis of the neoclassical model. All right, the next part of the lecture notes I'm going to skip, which gives all the special assumptions with respect to which you can generate a linear model. And that was done by Gary Solon in a paper many years ago. With reference to family investment models, I think that the frontier of the literature is really, it's due to work by Heckman and a cast of thousands, which looks at skills and intergenerational mobility. So the idea of this work is to say that, roughly speaking, that what parents generate for kids is much more complicated than just education. Rather, the idea is that you think of individuals as having, as adults, they have a set of skills. Some of the skills are called cognitive skills. This is going to subsume education as part of that, but it's overall basically the way people think and what information they have when they're thinking, how they solve problems, et cetera. And the other part is non-cognitive skills. And so those are going to be personality traits. So part of what parents give their kids or influence their kids are factors such as how conscientious they are, how hard you work, how open an individual is to different ideas, so on and so forth. So the new literature emphasizes that what happens in that first period is that you open up the 2-period overlapping generations model and make an argument that there's a richer set of determinants of behavior. All right. Cognitive skills often are forms of intelligence. Intelligence is not controlled entirely by genes, it's controlled by education as well. That's all it's saying. All right. So the idea is going to be that if you look at children, what's happening is that they have a level of cognitive skills and a level of non-cognitive skills. And those are evolving across childhood and adolescence. There's some initial conditions. That could be genotype. It could be ethnic group because of discrimination, so on and so forth. Every period, parents invest in their kids. And your skills today depend on what your skills were last period. So think of these, in other words, the modern theory has the equivalent of factor accumulation. So the upshot of all this is the classical models of family investment just said you invest, you produce education, and that's the end of the story. The modern theory would say you actually live from age 0 to 18. Every period there's an investment. And these investments accumulate in terms of their influences on individuals. Further, the thing that is produced is not a scalar called education, it's a vector called skills. All right. So what that does is this simply gives you a richer way to understand the nature of parental investments in their kids. And it has interesting implications. Okay. So one example would be the following, and that is that if you recursively substitute the skills of a child depend on the histories of the investments. So in other words, you don't have one investment, you have a sequence of them. Why would this be a big deal? If I'm thinking about the income constraints of parents, they may have different effects when a child is young than when a child is old. Remember, the classical model of permanent income just said there's a thing called permanent income. It didn't ask the question, can I borrow against my future income? I'll ask this class, how many of you are driving Mercedes Benzes to school every day? But why not? I happen to know this is true, by the way. If I thought about your lifetime incomes, they were high enough that you would be affluent enough to have a Mercedes Benz at the age of 25 or what have you. The answer, of course, is if you went to a bank to borrow the money, they would say no. There limits the ability to borrow against future income. And the serious point, of course, going to the model, is the parents in early life are going to face different constraints than later life. And that could affect when budget constraints matter. Okay, so that would be a new vision of what it means. The second thing to notice in the model is that it can exhibit a property called dynamic complementarity. And basically what that says is that these cross partials are positive. What do the cross partials say in words? They say the marginal product of investments today is higher when skills are already high. Why is that a big deal? Because it says that the investments in early life, not only are they more, do they increase the skills at that point in time, they raise the marginal product of the subsequent investments. And so that once again highlights the importance of early childhood investment, for which there's much evidence. All right. So what I wanted you to take from the second is the idea is that if you move to this notion of skills, and so given the time, I'm skipping a few things, is that you would have a richer vision of intergenerational mobility. Okay. In other words, you would think about lots of things parents do for their kids. They don't just invest in time, money, they invest time, how much you read your children, et cetera. The second is that budget constraints would have a life cycle component, and there'll be these dynamic interactions with dynamic complementarities you don't see in the two-period model. And that's a little bit of where the family literature is. Okay. A second approach to thinking about intergenerational mobility is social. And that would ask questions of the form, how does parental socioeconomic status affect what schools you attend, what neighborhoods you grow up in, et cetera? I'm going to talk about those in the second lecture. The third theory of intergenerational mobility is genetics. In other words, we have a biological fact, and that is that parents pass on genes to their children. And so another candidate theory would be that the reason that you for intergenerational elasticities of income is that income is derivative from the genotype of individuals, and so that's producing. All right. So on this, I want to just make a few comments. Okay. The first comment is that at one level, this is a triviality. In other words, I don't know anybody who thinks there's no such thing as, well, if anybody denies the heritability of genotype, they would be denying a fact, and so there's no conversation. I don't know anybody that denies that genes have some role in abilities and some role, therefore, in labor market outcomes. So the idea that some component of the persistence of socioeconomic status between parents and kids has to do with the passing on of genotype, I don't think is qualitatively controversial. What is extremely controversial is the magnitude. Is it a little bit or is it large? Yeah, that's the point I want you to see. That's comment number one. Comment number two, and this is very important to remember, if somebody says that genes matter for something, that doesn't mean that policy can't affect it. Sometimes there's discussions of the form that, well, that's genetic, there's nothing to do. That's all nonsense. And Arthur Goldberger, who wrote, I think, the most important work on what genes mean for social science, he gave a famous counterexample. It's these. Subject to a society having solved the nutrition problem, almost all differences in vision are genetic. They're also very inexpensive to correct. So if somebody says genes explains heterogeneity, that has no implication to the ability of policy to affect it. All right, everybody with me on that? Third thing is when I said that everybody, there's no debate that genes matter for something like ability. Those are all individual level statements. There is no evidence of group level differences of having anything meaningful to say about inequality. This is all about individuals. Okay, so what I want to put on the table, in other words, is the following, and that is that in my judgment, we're thinking that the persistence in genotype matters for mobility at one level is a triviality. I mean, it's simply a statement that there's something about the genotype that matters. What I want to say is the problem we have is we have no way of measuring the contribution. All right. And so what I do in the lecture notes is I go through a classic example of why it is hard to identify the role of genes. And it's based on twin studies. So one of the things that have been studied for the last century is twins. You look at how correlated twins are in income or some outcome. Everybody with me? And so some twins are monozygotic. They share 100% of the genotype. Some twins are dizygotic. They share 50%. And there's some twins that live together and some twins that don't. And so by comparing those twins and looking at the changes in the correlatedness, people have tried to measure how much genes matter versus the environment. The upshot of all of that is that you can't do it. In other words, there's actually, unless you make incredible, implausible assumptions, the fact that identical twins are more correlated than dizygotic twins doesn't tell you that genes matter a lot versus a little. The reason for that is very easy to see. And that is if parents raise identical twins more similarly than non-identical twins, is everybody with me? How can you tell whether it's the parents raising them or the genes that make their outcomes similar? And so once you introduce that type of heterogeneity into the study of kinship relations, you end up, and this is what the lecture notes will have, and I'm sorry I'm skipping very fast, you will end up with what my co-authors and I have called an impossibility theorem. And what it says is that any group of kinship relations you could have twins, you could have cousins, you could have the children of twins, so on and so forth. It's impossible to identify the relative roles of genes in the environment. Now, the reason that that's true, again, the algebra I'm skipping it fast, and I apologize. The reason for that is each kinship relation has a different implication for how similar the family backgrounds are. And I gave you what's the key thing is unless you can control for how similar family backgrounds are of kinship types, you can't tell whether it's the genes or the way they were raised. So the upshot of all of that is to say that at this point, we have no compelling empirical measures of how important genes are in generating intergenerational persistence. Okay, are there any questions on that? Now, the final thing I wanted to say about genes is there's a new development in genetics, which you should be aware of because it may prove to be important in social science, and it's called epigenetics. Epigenetics is the study of how environments affect the expression of genes. And so here's the big one. And that is the environment that a mother experiences during pregnancy affects the genetic expression in their children. So reason I want to bring this up is this is the new frontier on the interactions of genes in the environment. The one I gave you before was my kids look the same, I give them the same type of clothes or something like that. This is something deep and it's something that's important to understand. So let me spend a minute on it. The background of this is I want to tell you, here's a study that was done in medicine by medical geneticists. At the end of the Second World War, there was a famine in the Netherlands. When the German army was leaving, crops were destroyed. And so there was a brief famine. Everybody with me? And so here's the discovery. And that is if you look at adults who were in utero during the famine, they tend to be overweight. So in other words, I'm looking at these cohorts of Dutch adults, and there's a group that tend to be obese and relative to others, and the factor that distinguishes them is their mothers were pregnant during a famine with them. So one explanation you might have is that families where the mother was pregnant during a famine, they have different eating habits. They keep giving their kids food. That doesn't seem to be the explanation. One way you would test it is whether their siblings exhibit the same behavior, and you don't find that. It mattered that you actually were pregnant during the famine. the explanation that is given is the following. Okay, so the background is, those of you that don't know, are not familiar with biology like me, I used to think that the DNA was a blueprint. In other words, this DNA, that's the blueprint. The process of pregnancy assembles a baby from the blueprint. A better way to think about it is that our DNA is a set of blueprints. The fetal environment chooses which blueprint is operationalized. Everybody with me? And so what happens essentially, and it's very specific, and the pregnancy, it was one trimester that really influenced obesity. That's the trimester which in essence chooses the genetic expression for whether or not individuals crave calories. And so what was happening in essence was pregnancies during famines activated the genetic expression that produced children that craved calories. And so as adults in the non-famine environment, they became overweight. Think of it as a sugar tooth. Now, this is a very interesting idea because, and think about it, when humans evolved in hunter-gatherer societies, it would be adaptive to have this because lack of calories was driven by the environment. And so if the parent experienced it, it was likely the child would experience it. So you'd want your child to crave calories. Thanks to the glory of civilization, we have high frequency famines. And so what you had was a trigger to crave calories that was no longer applicable in terms of the environment. All right, so that's what epigenetics is all about. Why is this a big deal? There's evidence that these things can be transgenerational, not for humans, but in some plants and some animals. And what this says is that, in fact, the interactions of genes in the environment, they're not only a matter that once somebody's born, their genotype has some implications for what their environment's like. It's saying that the expression of their genes themselves are determined by the environment. So the summary of all of that is to say we don't really know anything about how to measure these things. I should say that current research in social science is actually using what are called gene-wide association studies. And what they are doing is they actually use measures of the actual DNA and are looking for correlations between genetic markers, or what are called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, jargon to say that when you look at the DNA molecule, you can look allele by allele at differences across people and to correlate those with various outcomes. I think the work's, obviously is interesting. No interpretation at this point in terms of behavior. So the upshot is, if you're looking for great areas to work on, I think understanding how we could use genetic data, genomic data, to actually understand various phenomena is probably is kind of where the frontier is. But at this point, we know nothing, or not know nothing. We know little about the magnitudes of the role of genes. So the upshot, I know I went extremely fast, is family investment models, either of the classical form or the skills form, are going to involve the ways that families invest time and financial resources into their children. Obviously, time as a constraint, and as does income. That creates the mapping. The social models I talk about after the break will say there's something different, and that is that parental socioeconomic status determines the environment in which people develop. The mystery in all this is going to be the genetic component, where we obviously is at some level it's a banality to say that it matters, but to say how much it matters, or does it matter in in what sense it matters, is completely unknown. So what I want to do just in the final couple of minutes is to talk a little bit about normative issues in intergenerational mobility. And I think the way I want to do that is I'm going to ask you to read the slides, and I just want us to talk about an example. All right. So I want to think about 3 Markov chains. So the Markov chain is going to describe the transmission from parent to child. And incomes can either be low or they can be high. So it's a 2-state Markov chain. All right, so I've simplified this structure down to a very simple thought experiment. Okay, the first Markov chain, if I have a low income, it's 50-50, my kids have a high income. If I have a high income, it's 50-50. Second Markov chain locks in the income. If I have a high income with probability 1, my child has a high income probability. If I have a low income probability, my kid has a low income is probability 1. Third Markov chain, if I'm poor, it's 50-50 whether my kid's high. If I'm rich, my kid's going to be rich. My questions to you are, number one, which of these environments has the most mobility? And two, which one would you, as a social planner, which one would you select? All right, is everybody with me? I've given you three processes that map parental income to offspring income. And I want to ask two questions. Which one do we want to say is the most mobile, or if I wanted to rank them on mobility? And then which one might I rank in terms of some ethical considerations?
So I think the first one is with the highest mobility, and me as a social planner, I would choose the third one, because a rich person will be rich, but poor person with high probability will be rich.
Okay, you've stolen my thunder. In other words, I agree with you, and those are the points I wanted to put on the table. The first point is the conventional measures, everybody with me, of mobility are lack of predictability. And so the first matrix is generally regarded as the most mobile. Of course, one has a little bit of a problem. How would you think about this one? In other words, if I had reversals of status in generations, might that be more mobile? And so one thing to think about is whether or not lack of predictability for the next generation is sufficient, or is it that family dynasties simply don't deviate? The second one, everybody would agree, has no mobility. So that was that's the sheet. The reason I wanted to put the last one on the table is it's extremely intriguing, because what it says is you do have persistence, but what it's capturing, and this was what Pavel recognized, is an asymmetry in the persistence. And that is, if you're poor, you have a large chance of having rich kids, but if you're rich, your kids are likely to be rich. This is capturing the idea that upward and downward mobility should be treated asymmetrically. Okay, that's missing.
I was just wondering whether that is actually possible, right? In one society, not everybody can be rich in that sense, and not everybody can be poor.
Okay, very good question, but notice that that's a statement about relative versus absolute. So if I had given you income rankings, then we would not have that possibility. But I'd say I rigged it so I get to have the possibility, because these were levels. So this is and so I wanted you to recognize that what I think is one of the missing ingredients in ethical evaluations of mobility is respecting those types of phenomena. And clearly the point you made was great. And that is that if everything's relative, then it really is zero sum. But in many dimensions, things are not zero sum. Okay, so let me finish with describing to you I'll tell you a personal story. When I was in high school, I was on the debate team, and I was researching something, and I saw a Markov chain in a book, and I never forgot it. And I, to this day, the book is on my shelf. I say, why did this thing shake me up? This book had a table from a paper that was the intergenerational occupational mobility of blacks and whites in the United States in 1962. All right. If you looked at whites, you had kind of the thing you would expect. If you were upper white collar, your kids had a good chance of being upper white collar. It was very unlikely your kids would be manual workers. If you looked at African Americans, there was something else. The probability, if you were upper white collar, that your child would be upper white collar was very low. But the probability that they were manual was very high. So in other words, what the black mobility table said was it didn't matter that much what the parents were doing, because it was extremely likely no matter what the parents were in the manual category. As I said, you may not believe me, but it's true. I never forgot because I was so shocked by it. That's what's missing in a lot of these discussions of mobility, is the recognition that what we're really concerned about is maximizing the opportunity sets for the less advantaged. And so I think that, there's certainly literature that study these things, but I don't think that the measures that we often report respect that asymmetry. And that seems to be normatively salient.
Oh, sorry. I just want to ask the book you just mentioned. So the lack of mobility among Black.
I'm going to ask you to email me and I will send you the paper that the book took a table from.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Okay, other questions?
Okay, so if we add to the concept of intergenerational mobility skills, investments in education, then can we use incomes of parents and children? I suppose not, because it refers to the approach of income elasticities. Then what can we use to estimate?
I think that's a fantastic question, and actually something I'm currently working on with a team at Indiana University. What we want to do is we want to actually use trajectories. So here would be the idea. Suppose I want to look at all the trajectories of family income and family structure, whether you're living with both parents or not, for people from age 0 to 18. Suppose I have the data on the trajectories. Then what I want to do is I want to sort the trajectories and say all these trajectories have the probability you go to college is 0.9. These trajectories have the probability that you go to college is 0.1. Okay. So then what you want to do is you want to say what makes these high probability trajectories, what makes these low probability trajectories. And so the upshot would be that what you do from that is what you try to identify level sets for certain outcomes for your kids. But there's not going to be a single number. What you're going to have is these are the things that high probability trajectories have in common. These are the things the low income ones have in common. And therefore the mobility measure would be endogenous to what the probabilities were. And so if you're interested in that, there's an area of statistics called functional data analysis, in which you think of the primitives of the objects as functions and a trajectory is just a function.
Sorry, that's a follow-up question to this functional approach. So I suppose you should use some micro data, maybe on.
Yes, all of this needs micro data.
And what if I want to estimate it for different countries? US, France, Germany, can I use macro or?
The information would get lost in the macro. But those countries all have panels, individual level surveys that can be used to do this estimation.
And yeah. I'm sorry, I have the last question. So I know from poverty studies that if we use, different sources of data, we will get different numbers of poverty. Is it the same with intergenerational mobility? If I use macro data, I will get biased results than if I use some tax payments or personal income surveys data. I don't know.
Well, I think I want to divide your question into two parts. The argument in favor of administrative data is that it attenuates the measurement error from transitory income. In that sense, there's an explanation as to why you get different answers from different data sets. And so I don't think of them as contradicting each other. There's a separate question about coverage, and that is the administrative data comes in, and it cuts in many directions. The administrative data comes in family incomes. And so the question is, that's not quite individual. You have to think about that somewhat differently. In terms of data sets such as the panel study of income dynamics, which are these ongoing surveys for decades of family dynasties. There, the issue is the attrition and whether or not that's affected the interpretations. And so I think it's that all the data set, there's no best data set. And so I don't think it is the case that there's a little bit of a dissonance between the administrative data sets and the survey data sets in terms of the estimates of mobility in the US, but I think that one would be hard pressed to say one was better than the other.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that of course leads to, but I think your question has a deep implication, which is suppose that you've all heard of something called meta-analysis. How do you aggregate information across studies? That's an interesting question here, which is if I have different data sets which have different defects, how would I aggregate them? That's not the standard meta-analytic question, but actually that's a useful thing to think about. Okay, other questions?
May I ask you a question? Sorry, I have no camera at the moment. The question about the last point about the ethical considerations in the distributive justice and the intergenerational mobility. The kind of bedrock assumption here is that ability should be rewarded in any case. Like, so if you're smart, you should be rich. But I kind of just see a little bit of not a contradiction, but something which requires some consideration. If you are smart, I mean, aren't you already kind of happier with the same income as a person who has not the same ability but has the same income? So wouldn't we even want to at some point to reverse, I mean, make it a negative kind of number to compensate those people who are disadvantaged with kind of extra wealth or extra income? I mean, this kind of can be kind of more radical sort of socialist kind of approach, I guess. No? Okay,
so let me divide the question. Well, let me answer it at different levels. One, the parts that I alighted because I didn't have time. And thinking about, one question is what are people, how do you think about fairness? And there, one idea would be that society should, and this is John Romer's idea, should eliminate inequality that people are not responsible for. All right, and so that would be an argument that if inequality is due to genes, society should eliminate it because nobody is responsible for their genes. On the other hand, if you and I go to a casino and you bet some money and I bet some money and I win and you lose, I don't really have an obligation to give you my money to equal. We're responsible. We knew what was going to happen. A different idea would be desert. Do I deserve things? They aren't the same. Okay, and so so there you would say somebody deserves the gold medal in the Olympics in the 100 meters because they ran the fastest, not because they worked the hardest. So even though it might be my genes had something to do with it, I still deserve it. Okay. There's disagreements in the philosophy literature on how powerful desert is a motivation, but I think that in the societies we all live in, it's an accepted principle.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The third question is, if I wanted to equalize people with respect to something about their well-being, what it is should I equalize? And what you brought up is this issue, the distinction between an objective measure of resources like income and well-being. So, the classic example is in philosophy, the thought experiment is suppose you had two people. I'm not going to name names. I won't tease anybody in the classroom. And says one of us likes, likes books. Okay. The other person gets utility from diamonds.
Mm-hmm.
Person who has expensive tastes have some claim to resources because the only thing that will make them happy is diamonds.
Mm-hmm.
That's a little bit of the same thing, isn't it, as your question, which is let's suppose that we have these other attributes. How do we think about equalization?
Yes.
Okay. And so I think that so the specific question you've asked is it's kind of as a standard challenge to maximizing average utility or redistributing on basic utilities. There's some stuff that we don't feel comfortable using as the basis for redistribution. And I think that the answer, and so the, I think the reason we don't go down the route you said is I could start bringing up everything and there'd be to meaningful, well, there's two things. One, it maybe it's subjectivity of the welfare measures. So you can just look at the budget constraint measures, you can make progress. The second is that it's a infinite regress. Here's another fact. People that are taller in most societies, at least in the United States, tend to do better, make more money. You know, there's some benefit to being, you know, they're more popular in school, et cetera. Do I compensate people for that?
Yeah, exactly about this. I think Ruben Nikolopov mentioned this in one of his lectures that, you know, the kind of a joke that there should be a tax on height. If you're tall, you should be taxed. Yes, basically, kind of a, yes.
Well, I think that those examples all have to do with kind of the limits to pure utilitarian calculations. And and the answer would be that we have certain domains of individuality we think should be sacrosanct. I'll give you a different example that's closer to this. Let's suppose you have two families or two types of families. Family A, they all have the same incomes, but in family A, the parents really care about education. So they spend many hours a week reading to their children or taking them to museums. Should society tax them because it's not fair to the kids in the families whose parents don't do that?
Yeah, interesting.
Schools have a policy that says that every family where the parents don't make the investments, we will hire somebody to do exactly the same things.
Thank you. Yeah.
And in that one, I would say the answer is even easier than height, and that is that if you did that, then what you would say is that you were going to deny parents the opportunity to invest in their kids with any product. And that would interfere with something that is in what I call the domain of privacy, of personal autonomy, that we would normally think of as prioritized over everything else. And so that's kind of the way that I would proceed on these arguments, is I would think about the case, again, in my own mind, the cases that I'm interested in tend to have that flavor as to whether there's something about individuals you wish to respect. And the issue about whether or not you should tax tall people. As I said, the problem with that is that it can't be principled, because you'd have to have a complete theory of utility. And there's too many dimensions of individuality to make heads or tails of that.
Thank you.
Begin the second lecture. So as I said, I will talk about social influences here, but I'm going to do it against the background of a paper. And this paper is called Understanding the Great Gatsby Curve, which I published a couple of years ago with Nancy Shadry. And the reason I want to do it this way is twofold. One is I'll discuss the social phenomena in the context of the paper, but second, to, in essence, allow me to draw some relationships between various theories of inequality and empirical implications. So the background, again, please ask questions in real time. What the paper wants to do is to address this phenomena called the Great Gatsby Curve, which has received a great deal of attention in both academia and in public policy. And the Great Gatsby Curve is the background to it was a study that looked at the relationship between intergenerational mobility and inequality across countries that was due to Miles Korak. Alan Kruger, who was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the US, called it the Great Gatsby Curve. I guess because the Great Gatsby Curve is about the Gilded Age in America, or the new Gilded Age of terrible inequality. Those of you that have read the book would agree it was a marketing name as opposed to substantive. But in any event, this was the phenomena that which created a lot of interest. And that is that if you looked at a particular set of countries for which there existed measures of both intergenerational mobility, the IGE, and something about cross-sectional inequality, some notion of the Gini coefficient, this was the plot that existed. All right. And so the stylized fact of the plot is there seems to be an upward relationship, a positive relationship between inequality at a point in time in a country and the associated intergenerational mobility. This was considered, and I think properly so, that something that's extremely interesting. And the reason for that is that in thinking about societies, there's inequalities is a very complicated beast, and there may be dimensions which move together versus dimensions in which there are trade-offs. The curve was of particular interest to the United States because it was inconsistent with a piece of American mythology, and that was that the US tolerates higher levels of inequality because it has more equality of opportunity. And so I said the American myth would be that there's massive opportunity here, and so that makes the inequalities one sees less morally questionable. However, if you look at the curve, the United States is sitting here, Scandinavia is sitting here, and South America is sitting here, and so you have a very different vision. In other words, it appears that countries that are more unequal are also less mobile on average. And it would appear that there's a set of countries that dominate the United States, and obviously Germany and Japan would look good here, Spain looks good here, in comparison to the US. Now, I think that, and part of what this paper is going to do is, and what I want to talk to you about is why there might be a relationship between the two. And in saying that, what I'm going to focus on is how within a country, greater inequality might slow down mobility. It's a different question to ask why you see this across countries. Okay, is everybody with me on that distinction? In other words, I want you to be aware of what the Great Gatsby curve is. It's a cross-country claim. I want you to be aware that any inferences from the cross-country claim are suggestive. That doesn't mean irrelevant or worthless. It means suggestive. And the reason for that is that it's very hard to compare countries for the trivial reason that they are so heterogeneous that it's kind of hard to know what to make of them when I do these types of comparisons. So I have often joked that the problem in comparing Norway and the United States is Norway is filled with Norwegians. And the serious point is that if I take a country of 4.5 million that's very homogeneous and compare it to one with 330 million that's very heterogeneous, it's not clear what it means to say one has higher mobility versus the other. After all, with respect to immigrants, you might come to a different conclusion than you would from the IGE, as I mentioned in the last lecture. And so I think that studying these types of cross-country things is important, but one has to recognize there are deep limitations to the ability to analyze them because we're dealing with such heterogeneous objects being placed in a common statistical framework. So what I want to argue, and what this paper is going to argue, is that the Gatsby curve can be thought of as an actual structural relationship, but it needs to be thought about it in the context of a given country. And what I mean by that is that I want to look at, think of the United States as the test bed for this and ask the question, are there reasons to believe that as you look at the changes in cross-sectional inequality across time in the United States, one would see associated changes in the levels of persistence in the country. Notice that is a different thought experiment than the cross-country Gatsby curve, which is fixing time, so to speak, in this country, that these two things co-vary positively or negatively, typically across the data set. Are there any questions on that? So again, as I said, this has political import for the United States because of this idea that the American choices on inequality were to maximize equality of opportunities as opposed to equality of outcomes. And one way to think about the Gatsby curve is it says that equality of opportunities and outcomes seem to be co-moving together as opposed to moving in opposite directions. So let me basically start off by just talking through the intuition, why there would be such a relationship. And then I want to talk about alternative explanations of the relationship, and then walk you through the theory. So the first, so you sort of said, why would we see a Gatsby curve? And what's this have to do with social explanations of intergenerational mobility? They're actually very tightly linked. Okay, the first idea would be the following. And that is, as the cross-sectional inequality in a society changes, in the United States changes, this changes the magnitude of the differences in the social experiences and the social context of the children of the rich and the poor. Okay, so what am I saying? Is I'm saying that if we think about the environments in which individuals, the social environments in which individuals grow up, the differences between those environments across rich and poor families are greater when there's more cross-sectional inequality. Now, that's going to be true for a trivial reason and for a less trivial reason. The trivial reason is that if I have a group of fixed neighborhoods, school districts, communities, if I increase inequality in the society, that says those fixed objects called communities, they're moving farther apart. So in other words, if I doubled the income of the rich neighborhood family versus the poor neighborhood, by definition, they would be farther apart as neighborhoods. The second point, which is less obvious, is that the degree of segregation of neighborhoods, of schools, of communities between rich and poor itself will be a function of the cross-sectional inequality. So what that means is as there's more inequality, the incentives for the rich, for the more affluent to isolate themselves are increased. And when those are increased, that is sufficient to say that there would be there may be mechanisms that lead to greater isolation of the rich and the poor compared to the rest of the society. All right, is everybody with me? So there's two different reasons to believe that the nature of socioeconomic segregation changes as you change the cross-sectional distribution of income. All right, now we're going to talk about this in the context of neighborhoods, but it's a very general property. And I want to emphasize that in thinking about this, that this is an example of what I've called the memberships theory of inequality. And the idea of the memberships theory is that group memberships matter for inequality, and group memberships are functions of inequality. Once you have those together, you get theories that generate Gatsby-type phenomena. So what's going to happen, in other words, is that once I have this link between cross-sectional inequalities, everybody with me, and the degree of segregation, you can then see how you get the relationship. The greater the cross-sectional inequality, the greater the segregation, the greater the gap between the social experiences of rich and poor kids, and hence the greater gap in their incomes when they become adults. Okay, so the devil's in the details. How do you write down a model that generates those phenomena? Okay, so that's kind of the first thing I want to say. Now, in understanding this, I want to now, okay, Bertha, are there any questions on where I'm going? I've started with what I'm calling the stylized fact, which is that if you look across countries, there seems to be the case that countries that are more unequal also have less mobility. I question the fact, not in terms of being a fact, but in terms of interpretation, because it's very hard to think about heterogeneous objects like countries and try to draw inferences from their correlatedness of variables. In contrast, we might ask the question in a given country, if you increase inequality, would that reduce mobility? And I'm going to put a theory on the table that says that this is going to happen in the United States because inequality begets segregation. Segregation begets persistence. So that's really what I want to put on the table. And I'm going to argue that creates a Gatsby curve for the United States. Are there any questions on that? So now what I want to do before I get to the model itself is I want to say something about the nature of the Gatsby curve. After all, the Gatsby curves, that's just another measurement. And in particular, what I want to do is I want to link the Gatsby curve to the IGE regression. Okay, everybody with me? One question you could ask is, can this model, the IGE model, generate the Gatsby curve? What would that mean? Well, it would mean the following. It would mean that I would take this equation and I could do the following. I could say that the variance of the outcome of the kids equals beta squared, the variance of the parents plus the variance of the errors, right? Everybody with me? Well, if the variance of the parents and the kids is the same, then the cross-sectional variance of income in a steady state is going to equal the variance of the errors over 1 minus beta squared. All right, think of this as a time series. If I had xt equals beta xt minus 1 plus epsilon t, I asked you what the variance of x is, that would be the variance. It's the same thing here. So all I'm saying is if you think about the IG regression, I can calculate a relationship between the variance of income and the persistence between generations. This shouldn't surprise anybody. At the end of the day, every relationship between parents and kids is simply a Markov process. Once I have a Markov process, I have measures of persistence and I have measures of variation. They all derive from a single process. And so the first observation to make is that in thinking about the Gatsby curve from the perspective of the IGE, it mechanically exists. It comes from the structure, from the statistical form. However, notice that it has a causality in it. If you raise beta, it raises the variance of income. And the reason for it is the bigger beta is, the bigger the variance of the part that's heritable in income, and hence the overall variance goes up. So what is it that I'm trying to say? What I'm trying to say is that from the perspective of the IGE and the measurements we've talked about, this Gatsby curve is not a surprise. In fact, it is mechanically generated by the linear relationship, because the linear relationship is an AR1, a first order vector, a first order regression, and it has mathematical links, or let's say it has necessary relationships between measures of persistence, the beta, and measures of dispersion, of inequality, which is the variance of the process. However, from the perspective of the model, the causality, as it were, only runs in one direction. Greater persistence induces greater volatility variation. So one message to take from this is that when people sort of put up the Gatsby curve as well, that's a shocking thing. If you think about it as a stochastic process, it's actually mechanically generated. So by itself, it tells us nothing. Okay, so that's kind of the background. On the other hand, I think I've already given you an intuition as to why there may be a causal relationship that runs not from the degree of persistence to inequality, but from inequality to persistence. And that's what I want us to understand. Why might there be a relationship between inequality and persistence, in which the inequality creates the persistence? So the way to think about that is the following, and that is, let's suppose, and notice, if this is the true relationship and one is the story, we're done. There's nothing else to say. There is no Gatsby curve in the behavioral sense that I described. What I am saying to you, in other words, is the following, and that is, if I want a Gatsby change in which changes in the variance of parental income are the changes in the variance of income are inducing changes in the persistence, then I have to think about this differently. what I have to say is the following, and that is that this is a misspecified model and this is the true model. And so you see, this is how you'd have to think about it. It's relatively subtle. You'd have to say to yourself that the linear relationship is misspecified. But even if a model is misspecified, I can always run a regression, can't I? If you tell me the truth is that y has a nonlinear relationship to x, I can still run a linear regression of y on x. But what's going to happen is my estimate will change according to the nature of the way the linear model approximates the true nonlinear model. Is everybody with me on that? If the truth were linear, you get the same answer no matter what the values were for the x's, what the values are for the independent regressors. If the truth is nonlinear, then every linear model is a linear approximation of a nonlinear system. And the nature of the approximation is going to depend on which part of the system you're approximating. And so the way to understand why it is that inequality would create the Gatsby curve is you have to say inequality changes the value of beta in the linear regression. And the reason it changes the value of beta in the linear regression is that the structural relationship is nonlinear, and therefore the linear approximation is changing as you change inequality.
Professor, will this be feasible in the overlapping generation model?
When you say feasible?
Yeah, mathematically possible.
Well, the model I'm going to give will be overlapping generations. It will generate this result. But a second question is whether or not the data are rich enough to let you distinguish theories, and that's going to be a data issue. But certainly theoretically, the OLG is sufficient to do this. So what I wanted you to see is the following, and that is point number one is that the Gatsby curve is a causal relationship, is a mechanism. Really is saying that the IGE is misspecified because the IGE by definition can't generate it. However, the way you would constructively proceed is to say that we're interested in models in which the sensitivity of offspring income to parental income is a functional relationship where beta depends on things. All right. So one example would be, what if the relationship is nonlinear? So in other words, I actually said that XI equaled the parent's income. That would just give me a nonlinear intergenerational mobility model. And it is possible to generate a Gatsby curve simply because of nonlinearity. And so the way to think about that is a linear approximation to the nonlinear parental income model. As I spread income out, I'm approximating different parts of the function. In the linear model, it doesn't. The function is always the same, so that there's no true part of the function is revealed by spreading income out, and the weights to different parts of the function doesn't matter. Now, different theories are going to take different changes of x, but I want you to see even nonlinearity is going to do it. Okay, so the Lowry model and the Becker and Tomes model in particular can generate this relationship. That's what they say. They would say this. And so the Becker, Tomes, and Lowry models generate a Gatsby curve when there are nonlinearities in the family investment model. The model I'm going to present is going to take Becker and Tomes and Lowry, but it's going to be a purely social model. In other words, the model is only going to have intergenerational mobility generated by public education. So the Lowry model in Becker and Tomes would generate the Gatsby curve by having a nonlinearity there. I'm going to generate it by having the beta depend on community factors. And that's going to be a different route to the Gatsby curve. Everybody with me on that? So I've actually covered a lot of points that are important in thinking about the relationship between theory and data. Point number one is that when people make observations about the relationship between one aspect of a stochastic process and another, in this case, measures of persistence and measures of inequality, one has to ask the question about whether or not the stochastic process links them because of the nature of the process, not because of substantive economics. I'll give you an example of that. A first order autoregressive model, there's a relationship between the of the model and the unconditional variance of the time series. That is simply a general principle. Once I give you, if you give me a Markov process, from the Markov process, I read off every statistic. One statistic will be the variance, another statistic will be your choice of persistence. And so it's actually a bad way to think about these things, I think, that there's the different statistics you should be grafted. I think rather what you want to say is here's a stochastic process. It induces relationships between the statistics. And that's been, very understudied in the applications of, or at least in these types of models. So what is it I want to say about how to think about the Gatsby curve as a causal relationship? Well, I wanted to say mathematically what it's going to do is it's going to say that you can write down a nonlinear transmission process between parental income and offspring income, in which this beta is going to actually depend on neighborhood characteristics. Once you have that, then you're going to get this relationship as being causal. So what am I going to claim? Okay, so here's going to be the summary of the environment. So all the algebra is going to say this. Okay, the first is I'm going to follow Becker and Tomes and Lowry and say that in these models, labor market outcomes are going to be determined by human capital that's accumulated early in life. This, by the way, I made a comment about kind of thinking about the relationship between models and countries. This is a very American thing. And I'm not, and I mean that seriously. British models of inequality and mobility historically focused on inheritance. The American models focus on human capital. And that's for, as I said, I think that that's actually for cultural reasons. So Americans think about inequality. Okay, so again, the key is going to be that it's human capital is the key, is the driver of economic success and lack thereof. The second assumption, and this is what's going to make the model different from the Becker and Tomes model or the Lowry model. And remember, all of them are subsets of the family investment model in which everything's controlled by the parental budget constraint, is that I'm going to assume that education, human capital, is socially determined. What that means is rather than think about the human capital, the education of children is decided by their parents in isolation, it's decided collectively. Okay, at some level, that's an easy thing to say as empirical verisimilitude. After all, we aren't living in the 18th century in Great Britain, where if I'm a lord, I hire a tutor for my children, and the greater my land holdings, the better the tutor I have. Rather, we have something called public education, in which there's collective investment, and that's producing outcomes. All right, everybody with me on that? So you could say that's a triviality. But what's going to create inequality in public education? Why would human capital formation in a public goods economy be unequal? Well, focusing on the United States, one reason is that the United States has a substantial fraction of public education, and I'm focusing on kindergarten, age 17, is determined by local taxes. So the US is broken up into something on the order of 14,000 school districts, and school districts raise money internally to fund schools. Now, obviously, monies also come from the federal government and the state government, but a substantial fraction, I think it's on the order of 40% of the revenues occur locally. And there are very substantial differences in per capita resources per student across school districts in the US. Notice that the local public finance immediately creates a relationship between segregation and quality of education. Okay, but I emphasize this is an American thing. In other words, the public finance of education is handled differently in other countries. That's reason one. The second reason why it matters what school you go to, what neighborhood you live in, is what I'm going to call social interactions. In other words, that outside the process of education has social determinants. In other words, there's going to be peer effect. There can be peer effects in education. There can be role model effects in education. There can be social network, labor market connection effects to education. There can be exposure to social ills such as violence that affect education. And so the upshot is that if you think about a whole host of what I'm going to call sociological influences, all of them imply that neighborhoods with different socioeconomic distributions of people are going to have different effects on their kids. A very concrete one, exposure to violence has catastrophic, it is very well documented in the United States, has terrible effects on children in terms of their ability to learn. And so if the segregation of neighborhoods means that you have large numbers of children in poor families that are routinely hearing gunshots at night, there's going to be, and there is, a first order effect on education. But I want you to see that there's a distinction in thinking about how the political economy, the rules for financing public goods would create spatial, locational inequality versus why these sociological factors would. Or to give a different example, if you think about a neighborhood in which nobody has seen a doctor who has the same skin color as the children, is that going to affect the educational aspirations of children, of adolescents? The answer is, of course, yes. And so I could go on, but these are all, I'm going to call them sociological influences. Are there any questions about that?
Can I ask one more question here? So I'm also thinking the early human capital investment by parents might be also partly determined by the parents' expectation about the return to education later. So it's like the inequality is also causing parents to invest in education if the return comes from the labor parts.
I think that that's right. Now, it's not clear what the income and substitution effects are.
Yeah.
In other words, probably the best evidence is there's complementarity between neighborhood quality and parental investments. In other words, parental investments are more efficacious in more affluent neighborhoods. But if that's true, it's not clear, but the parents may decide to invest even more to overcome that. So the net effects are a little bit tricky to work out, but I think that's a good point.
Yeah, thanks.
Other questions? All right. Point number 3, and that is when neighborhoods form, in other words, or school districts form, communities form, there exist incentives for parents to want to have affluent neighbors. In other words, and why would that be true? One reason would be because my rich neighbors can pay more in taxes, so there's more money available for schools. Another reason is my economically successful parents are going to have more labor market opportunities that can communicate to my kids, so on and so forth. In other words, in these models, there'll be some incentive to have more affluent neighbors, other things equal. At the same time, there'll also be incentives to prefer larger communities. In other words, I don't want my children to be completely isolated, partially because there may be fixed cost to education. Makes it harder to educate them if they're by themselves. And there can be intrinsic values to some diversity. Those create non-trivial trade-offs. In other words, very affluent families are facing a trade-off between larger communities and richer communities per capita. And so what that's going to do when you have those two influences, the trade-off between them is going to control the degree of segregation you see in equilibrium. Everybody with me on that? So the idea is going to be that, well, again, to make this concrete, if the income distribution is very compressed, it's not a big deal to me to have neighbors that are less affluent than me. They're not that less affluent, and I get benefits from having more neighbors. In contrast, if the gap between my neighbors and me income-wise is very large, that creates incentives for me to want to be more isolated. Now, it's going to turn out that in the equilibrium of this model, it's possible to get permanent segregation. However, it will not be mechanistic. In other words, there's no probability one statements in the model. Everything is, there's some chance something is going to happen. And so what's going to then link everything together is the greater the cross-sectional inequality of income, that's going to increase the degree of segregation of neighborhoods. The greater the segregation of neighborhoods, the greater the disparities in human capital between children of more and less affluent families. And the greater that disparity, the greater the persistence of socioeconomic status. And that's the theory of the Great Gatsby curve. Now, what I want to say, I want to emphasize is there's more than one way to get the Gatsby curve. And I think there's two alternative explanations you should be aware of. The first I described, which is that if there is a nonlinear relation between income of parents and income in kids, that can generate the Gatsby curve. In particular, you can generate this with credit constraints. In other words, if it's disadvantaged families that are credit constrained, that alters the sensitivity of the outcome of their kids to their incomes, than if you're not credit constrained. And so if you spread out the income distribution, you change the fraction of families that are credit constrained, that starts changing the beta in the misspecified model. And that idea is due to Casey Mulligan. A second way to generate the Gatsby curve would be what's done in this paper by Becker, Commoners, Murphy, and Spencook, in which what they said is that the marginal product of parental investments depends on the parent's education. So the idea is that if I'm highly educated, every dollar I spend on my kids more productive on education than otherwise. Once you introduce that, you will also get a Gatsby curve. And the reason for that is the more spread out the incomes of the parents is an empirical matter, the more spread out are the education levels of the parents and greater heterogeneity in the productivity of parental investments. So does everyone see a distinction? It's one thing to say parents have different incomes, so invest different amounts. It's a different thing to say that those investments themselves are heterogeneous in what they do. And of course, there's compelling evidence parental education matters in terms of the efficacy of investments. So my claim is not that this is the only way to get the Gatsby curve, but it's a way to get the Gatsby curve. Okay, questions?
Yes, I just want to add about the neighborhood equilibrium. So what is stopping the poor moving into the affluent area? Okay,
that's a great question. And that's part of what I have to do in the model is I'm going to have some way to limit that. The way it gets limited in reality, one way would be prices. So I grew up in the San Fernando Valley in Southern California. And you might ask, why didn't my parents move to Beverly Hills, which is, as you may know, where very wealthy people live, which has a fantastic schools? And the answer is very simple. They couldn't afford to. So if you look at rental prices or housing prices, those are a mechanism that will segregate. However, the story is much more complicated. There are also what are called zoning restrictions. In other words, that there are laws that limit the way that neighborhoods are constructed. The most common zoning restriction in the United States says that in this neighborhood, you cannot build multifamily units. That says there's no apartment buildings. So in other words, it's very common for places to have laws that say you can't build apartments, but that restricts who's going to live there in terms of income. And so there's a whole host of zoning restrictions. In the model I give, it'll be driven by zoning restrictions, but you can write down analogous models in which prices are sufficient to induce the segregation. Okay, so that's where we are. So let me talk about the overlapping generations model to instantiate these ideas. Okay, it's going to be the usual thing, and that is that I'm going to have a set of dynasties. There's no reproduction is asexual, and so I'm going to want to think about the structure in a way that's similar before, but not the same. And so the logic of the model is everybody lives 2 periods. So these are my 2 periods of life. That's my child's 2 periods, so on and so forth. And so that's childhood and adulthood, childhood and adulthood, childhood and adulthood. So the way that it works is in the first period of life, that's childhood. Again, the agent is completely passive. The child receives human capital investment, not from their parents, but from their neighborhood. In other words, something happens when you're growing up. That something is you attend a school and you experience social influences from the neighborhood. In adulthood, period 2, an adult converts human capital into income, becomes a member of a neighborhood, has 1 child, and then consumes and pays taxes, and those taxes collectively are the resources for education. And after period 2, the parent shuffles off the mortal coil. So that's that. All right, so very simple demography. A couple of comments. One of them is there are interesting questions when you allow for endogenous fertility. In other words, the number of kids that families have. And the reason for that is that that's going to, that then creates complicated issues of the of whether or not, does having more than 1 child, does that affect the ability to invest in your children? Is everybody with me on that? That type of question isn't showing up here. I will add a big research question is to understand the effect of relaxation of the 1-child policy in China. The evidence so far generally suggests the relaxation of the constraint is not having large effects on behavior. This is still under study because obviously is new. And the explanations are it's that Chinese families wish to invest very high amounts in their kids. And therefore the binding constraint wasn't the law, it was the desired investments. So my point is that if you think about models in which parents invest in their kids and you endogenize fertility, it's a 2-way street. In other words, you have to ask how the endogeneity of the fertility is sensitive to the nature of what you do for your kids. Okay, everybody with me on that? All right, that's the first part of the model. Now I'm going to be explicit about preferences. The other models, as I said, were entirely driven by budget constraints. This one I need to introduce some preferences. So the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to assume the parents have Cobb-Douglas preferences between the logarithm of their income and their child's, the logarithm of their child's income. Now, why am I doing it this way? There's really 2 things here. One is, why did I assume that this is what parents care about? And 2, why Cobb-Douglas? Okay. As I mentioned before, maybe parents care about the education of their kids. That's what they get utility from. Or maybe they get utility from their parents' utility, from their kids' utility. I chose this for 2 reasons. 3 reasons. One, it's actually easy to calculate things, and that's a virtue. Second, you don't get qualitatively different answers with other assumptions. And 3, I think this is the best one in the following sense, that I think by introspection at least, what does the parents want to do for their children? I think the thing they want to do is create opportunities for them. What my kids do is their business and their utility functions are not knowable to me, but I do know their opportunity sets. And so in this model, the incomes of the offspring is the sufficient statistic for the opportunity set. But people can disagree. What's more important is the Cobb-Douglas assumption. The Cobb-Douglas assumption is not made because of any love. Well, actually, no, it's because I do love it, because it, again, makes calculations easy, but more importantly, it will address problems that can occur in the model. Here's the problem, okay, in the model. Jiaxi, is that how you pronounce your name? You brought up the first question, which is how do I ensure that the neighborhoods are segregated in equilibrium? The other problem is how do I make sure there's actually equilibria in the neighborhoods on voting. If education is a public good, how do we decide what happens? Both of those problems are very complicated if there's disagreements on the optimal tax rate. Those of you in microtheory remember the arrows and possibility theorem and all of that. There's cases where you get non-existence of things like equilibrium voting or equilibrium tax rates. I wanted to ignore, all of those are things we don't care about. I mean, they're interesting in other contexts. In this context, they would be digressions. And so the Cobb-Douglas has a wonderful property, and that is budget shares are constant. Remember, go back to your original micro. Under Cobb-Douglas preferences, the fraction you spend on each good is constant. We're going to use that because you just spending on a good in a public economy like this one is the tax rate. So everybody's going to agree on the tax rate. And so I'm not going to have to worry about that. Okay, and that's the thing you need to think about when you read theory papers is what the rules, how to think about assumptions. And there, the pieces of advice I would give you are number one, don't judge assumptions whether or not they're right, they're true or false. They're presumably all false at some level, but whether they're useful. Do they facilitate what you want to get out of the model? And for theory models like this, what you wish to extract from the model is understanding. Does the model elucidate certain mechanisms and the consequences of them in equilibrium? That's the measure of success. In empirical work, it's harder. You can't make assumptions because the model's easy. You have to make it, you can't, if it invalidates the actual properties of the individuals you're studying. There you have to judge them differently. But in theory, you use the understanding metaphor as the key criterion for judging. Okay, other questions?
So the Cobb-Douglas function has this assumption of the elasticity of substitution being 1. So do you think that it's going to be useful for the US case to have this elasticity as 1? Or are there any other papers trying with other kind of elasticities?
Well, this is going to be a little self-referential. My original papers on this, none of them had Cobb-Douglas. And what happened was all the theorems were hard to read. They have exactly the same qualitative properties, but they were written in a cumbersome, messy fashion. If you write it with Cobb-Douglas, you get crackerjack clean statements. And there was nothing qualitatively interesting that differentiated them. So in that sense, I would say the earlier papers that I wrote didn't relax it. And they were more general because they were theorems based on fewer assumptions, but I don't think I learned anything from it.
Thanks.
Can I ask you a question, please? How would you define the adulthood period? How it is different?
Well, metaphorically, the childhood is thought of as some. Actually, the definition would be something like 30 to 60, but it's just a period called adulthood, and so in that sense, you might say, well, people from 0 to 30, they don't really sound like children after a certain age, but this is because the time index is generations and not years.
Yes, but how would you define those children who are at the school to work transition period when they're graduating from school, high school, secondary school over to work? Are they considered to be adults or children still? And can we use those decisions for measuring the mobility?
Well, I think it's a great question, but that's going to require a richer model than this one. But you would like to have multiple stages. And part of it is what education you have. And then the second is the move from the education to the labor market. There's some other things you would think about, which is what I call social networks. In other words, a neighborhood where people know lots about job opportunities, that helps kids. And so you can model richer in those dimensions, but because it only has 2 stages, the assumption is once everybody has education, they go to the labor market and automatically get a job.
Yeah. And what is your view on those children that continue to higher education and those who choose to go to work? in terms of this, again, upward or downward mobility?
Well, I think as a factual matter in the United States, if you don't go to college, you're extremely unlikely to do well. And so in some sense, the key is college. Gap between college and graduate school is, the fraction of people that involves is small enough that I wouldn't focus on that. So I think that I think the thing called the quality of education in these models, ultimately you decompose it into what you experienced through high school and then what your transition is into college, with a 0 being the alternative. Would be a nice but richer, a more complicated model.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks.
So in this model, there's going to be a very simple choice of function that's going to relate human capital to income. And so my income as an adult depends on the product, some constant term there, of my human capital with some shock. And that shock can be, is going to have both a individual component, it could be ability, and it can be a social component. Norms in my neighborhood, things like that. All right, now, if you go back to the previous lecture notes, I had a function that related education to income in the general model. Here, I chose a function. What's important about that function? It's linear, which means it is not concave, which means that it is possible over time, this economy will be growing. Human capital will be growing over time. And that's why we think of it as a quality of human capital. Not because the number of years is going to be fixed. And so you're going to have secular growth in the economy, in education, hence in human capital, and hence in incomes. And a message that I want to get across is that inequality in a growing economy, we think about differently than a stationary economy. And so the way and this is for those of you that have done macro, this is called an AK model, is a linear growth model. All right, family expenditures are going to be social, as I said. My income either goes to consumption or it goes to taxes. And so now everybody with me on those? So now we have kind of the key points that look similar to the original model. So here's the new stuff. What determines the education in these neighborhoods? The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to assume that every neighborhood has a tax rate that's linear. Once you tax everybody, you sum up the resources you get from them, and that gives me the total resources, the total expenditure a neighborhood can produce. Okay. Now, let me make a couple of comments. Number one, actually one comment, which is you might say, why do I want the taxes to be linear? And the answer is both for, I've emphasized simplicity, and that is important in theory. You want the model to be, as Einstein said, as simple as possible, but not too simple. And so the ability to calculate things is facilitated, but it's more than that, which is once I have nonlinear taxes, it's very hard to think about the existence of equilibrium taxes. So let me give you an example. Suppose that everybody in this lecture is going to give we're going to decide what the tax rate is for everybody in the lecture, okay? Here's the first thing I can promise you, and we know everybody's income. Somebody in this classroom has the highest income. What should we tax them? Remember, we're self-interested, homo economicus. The tax rate for the particular income that is highest, oddly enough, is 100%. And it won the election. How many people are in the lecture? 45? 44-1. My point is that what we should do is you take the richest person and you tax them 100%. So they're out. What about what should we do next? Let's take the second highest person. We're going to tax them 100%, so on and so forth. What are the top two people going to do? They're going to drop the class. They're going to leave the neighborhood. And you see what the serious point is? When you have nonlinear taxes, you have to explain why the upper tail isn't expropriated. And in other words, what they're doing in the neighborhood to begin with. And those are the types of issues that are problematic for describing equilibria, and they kind of don't address things that are salient for us. Okay, this particular model is kind of cumbersome. There's lots of moving parts. It's not elegant the way the family investment models are. And part of in the construction of the models is to have, as I said, eyes on the prize. And that is at the end, we want an equilibrium configuration of people across neighborhoods, and we want equilibrium tax rates in every neighborhood. And so one wants to make choices of assumptions to ensure that those things happen.
I have a question.
Sure.
So I understand to why you chose. I mean, I think I understand why you chose the linear tax rate, but I don't think that's really realistic in terms of taxes in the U.S. So how do you reconcile, the fact that it's not as realistic in the U.S. context?
Oh, so there I would disagree with you, because I'm talking about the local taxes for education.
Oh, okay.
Okay, those are property taxes, and properties, there's not a separate real estate market, and so the quality of my house is proportional to my income. That would be the mapping.
Oh, okay. So thank you.
Excuse me, may I ask you a question as well?
Sure.
Well, this last example about the question why these two richest people stay in the same neighborhood, isn't this something which kind of connects us to Mansur Olson's theory of collective action? Because from my experience, for example, is quite the opposite. I mean, I have a similar situation. I have a country house in the countryside with about 50 neighbors, and it's exactly the same situation. There are 2 or 3 richest individuals and about 45 or so middle-income people. And what happens is the opposite. So these richest individuals actually exploit their situation because they have the most economic power, bargaining power, and so on. And these more poorer people, they pay equal contributions to the sort of self-imposed taxation on this community, and so on and so on. So and there are all sorts of other complications which I discussed in, for example, Eleanor Ostrom and things like that. Can we somehow use this, or is this too remote from what we are discussing? Thank you.
Well, I think if you ask the explanation for heterogeneity of neighborhoods, everything you said makes much sense. The issue, again, is if I built those into the model, they would simply make the model more complicated. Okay. And if you look at actual tax rules, they tend to be pretty crude. In other words, you have progressive taxes or bands that are linear, and then so I don't think we're losing much substantively, and I would be very worried about how to actually write the model if I put those factors in.
Thank you.
Okay. However, you brought up some things deep and important, which is if we're talking about the political economy of inequality, you have to talk about power. And so it's not just a matter of, one person, one vote and equal power. You'd have to account for these other factors. And so I think in different contexts, it would be absolutely essential to talk about your ideas.
Thank you.
Okay. Now, the final thing I wanted to say about the model is I'm going to assume a relationship between the amount of money that a district has, the resources, the population of the neighborhood, and the quality of education. And the assumption is going to be that there are some non-convexities in producing education. And what that means is that other things equal, having a larger pool of resources will produce higher quality of education, not just because there's more, but because there's some fixed costs and the like that can be addressed. Now, there's evidence, of course, of non-convexities in the quality of education, I don't think this is some thrilling assumption. It's really just made to give a rationale for neighbors to prefer to have, for richer neighbors to prefer poorer neighbors. I think that it's a better assumption than simply saying there's 2 neighborhoods and half the people have to live in each, or there's 25 neighborhoods and 4% live in each, et cetera. The reason for that is that since the model wants to have endogenous segregation, I wouldn't want to build anything in that requires segregation. And so this typical strategy in the literature will be to fix the number of neighborhoods. Here, I'm going to allow the number of neighborhoods to be endogenous. Next thing I have to do is to complete the relationship between education and human capital. The first thing, and that's simply going to be a linear function as before. And the extent to which parental skills and things matter, I can build them, I can allow the constant term in this to depend on them. So it's actually not a constant term, but it's a product of this function with the quality of education. So this can capture the Becker commoners, Murphy-Spencock idea that more highly educated parents make the kids more productive, make the investments more productive. All right, everybody with me on those points? And so the way I'm going to build in social interactions is I'm going to assume that this skill stuff depends on both the parents' income themselves, and it depends on the average type of parent in a neighborhood. Okay, we're almost done. In other words, that's all the micro foundations. Now I have to talk about equilibrium. Okay, so the way that's going to work is every generation, there's going to be a new set of neighborhoods. There's no housing stock, in other words. In that sense, the neighborhoods are like clubs. And neighborhoods are just groupings of families who form a common neighborhood and educate their kids. If you introduced housing, the problem there is there are capital gains. There's 2 problems. One is capital gains you'd have to account for, and that would, be a complication that would be difficult to analyze. The second is that once you introduce capital gains, then you can get weird types of multiple equilibria. Suppose this generation, Beverly Hills, is the neighborhood the rich live in, but everybody thinks that next generation is going to be Burbank. Then you would have the rich moving back and forth and strange things happening like that, which without going into too excruciating detail would be digressions from what the model do. Now, the way the equilibrium formation works here is going to be simple, and that is that families form neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods have zoning restrictions. The zoning restriction can say there's a minimum income to join the neighborhood. Okay, in the real world, there are not laws that say you have to have an income to get into a neighborhood. There are laws that essentially segregate neighborhoods by income by placing requirements on the housing. I gave you one example: no multifamily dwellings. Another, again, a separate example is Woodside, California. Doesn't have a fire department. It requires every house to have a swimming pool large enough. I'm sorry, it doesn't have fire hydrants. It requires that all of the houses have swimming pools large enough to put a fire out. Okay, that's another way of saying the houses have to be very high quality and hence very expensive. Right. I show in one of the papers that's cited that you can also sustain the equilibrium with prices that we talk about, but the housing one is just the zoning restrictions are cleaner. Okay, everybody with me on that? All right, final assumption, political economy. And that is the way this works is once the neighborhoods are formed, there's a tax rate that will be an equilibrium in the neighborhood, and it has to be what's called a majority voting equilibrium. To be a majority voting equilibrium, there does not exist an alternative tax rate a majority would vote for if there's a head-to-head election. So in other words, tau star is an equilibrium if there's no tau prime that could defeat it 1-to-1 in an election. This is ensured by the Cobb-Douglas assumption because that got rid of the disagreements on optimal taxes. As mentioned, there are borrowing constraints. Neighborhoods cannot borrow against their kids' incomes, future incomes, in order to educate them more. All right, lots of moving parts, but I want you to have the idea in your head as to what's going on. Individuals have formed neighborhoods. Those neighborhoods determine the educational levels of the kids. Those interact with social factors and family factors to produce overall human capital in a child, which then determines a child's adult income. Second idea, there's incentives to form heterogeneous neighborhoods because of non-convexities in human capital formation. There's incentives to have homogeneous neighborhoods because of the benefits to affluent neighbors. Next set of ideas, and that is there's no restriction on the number of neighborhoods or the size of neighborhoods. They're entirely voluntary configurations that completely endogenizes the degree of segregation. And there has to be majority voting in all of the neighborhoods. So what do you get out of that? You get a set of propositions. How does the model work? So the first thing is to say is that there will exist a nearly unique configuration of neighborhoods every period that's in equilibrium. What that means is that there will be a single configuration of neighborhoods that's in equilibrium. The only thing is there may be endpoints which are indeterminate. There may be some families on the margin that are indifferent between two neighborhoods. That's an uninteresting form of multiplicity because nothing changes if they're in one neighborhood versus another. The second thing is to say that in the equilibrium, the neighborhoods are segregated. In other words, if there's more than one neighborhood, there will not be an overlap in the support of the incomes. All right, the way that you could understand this is that under the zoning restriction rule, this is literally how you construct the neighborhoods. You take the richest family in the population, you ask that family, what's your preferred neighborhood? That family gives an answer. And you can prove everybody the richest family wants to live with also wants to be in that neighborhood. So they form a neighborhood and they will unanimously erect a minimum income requirement. That's neighborhood one. You take the richest remaining family, ask them the same question, you get the same answer. And so what you can do through that sequential process, you can generate the neighborhoods that will be the neighborhood equilibrium. And notice the least affluent families are being rejected as neighbors by the more affluent families, and some group ends up isolated in the poorest neighborhood. Second proposition is the following.
Oh, hello, can I ask one quick question there?
Of course.
So in terms of the equilibrium in the affluent area, then isn't there another incentive for the rich neighborhood to further split into smaller size, because the richest one probably only want to live on their own?
Well, that's why there was, remember, built into the model a preference for larger neighborhoods. That's the non-convexity of human capital.
Okay, thanks.
And I could get the same thing if I get intrinsic utility from larger neighborhoods. I mean, if you want to be, again, I don't want to, these are going to sound like little micro things. The size of a school matters for its quality. There's only one student, that limits the number of classes I can offer. And so I would go down that route. Okay, so the first idea is all the equilibria will be segregated by income. The second thing is that if you take the richest and the poorest family, okay, in any equilibrium, there will be a threshold that has the following property, and that is, actually there'll be two thresholds. Whatever the assumptions are in technology and preferences, there are some thresholds such that families above threshold 1 will not live with families below threshold 2. That's just a fancy way of saying that in the model, there are these trade-offs between the incentives for isolation and the incentives for larger communities. And eventually, if the income gap between the richest and the poorest is big enough, it can overcome the incentives for having neighbors. People will eventually isolate themselves. Okay. And so again, the disadvantage to the less affluent neighbors is because of the tax base and because of what are called the social interaction effects. The benefits to agglomeration had to do with the non-convexities in production, and so there's a trade-off there. Now, if you think about it, I now have a very easy, well, I have a way of describing the Markov process for families. And that is the way I set the model up. The conditional probability of every individual, there's a Markov process for the whole population, and it has these conditional probabilities. The conditional probability of my kid, what you need to know is the size of the neighborhood they grew up in and the per capita income. Now, the bad news is that's actually kind of hard to analyze. The family models were just simple Markov processes. These are much more complicated structures. Nevertheless, there are some results we can get from them. Here's the first proposition. These are now these are the messages I want to end the lecture with. It turns out that in this model, the equilibrium neighborhood configuration is income inequality maximizing. Of all of the possible configurations of neighborhoods, the one that maximizes the expected value of the gap between the child of today's richest family and today's poorest family is the equilibrium one. Why is that? It's because, well, it's because the richest neighborhood is the one that's the best for the richest family of all possible neighborhoods. And because people keep rejecting having the poorest family as neighbors until some residual neighborhood, that's the worst neighborhood possible for the poor family. And so this is a good example of, I don't want to call it an equity efficiency trade-off because equilibrium is not efficient, but it's an example of how an equilibrium can produce something that's highly inequitable. All right, and so in other words, a social planner, even if they were randomly assigning families to neighborhoods, couldn't do any worse than the equilibrium if worse means maximum equality between the richest and the poorest. Second observation is that this neighborhood, actually, this model has differential growth rates between rich and poor neighborhoods. What that means is, remember, it's a growing economy, not a stationary economy. And what's happening in the model is that if you look at two neighborhoods of equal size, the expected growth in income between parents and kids is bigger in the richer neighborhood. That's because there's greater investment in human capital, in education, excuse me, per student, and the social interactions are favorable for the production of income. Now, suppose, okay, so now here's the vision I want you to have in your heads. I have this population in which an expected value of the family incomes are growing for everybody, but the ones in the rich neighborhoods on average are higher than the others. And then every generation, they're reforming neighborhoods. What you can then show is that what you can have with positive probability is that the upper and lower tails decouple from the rest of the population. What do I mean by that? With positive probability, there will be a top alpha percent and a bottom beta percent of the population in income at time t. Their descendants are never in the same neighborhood. The reason for that is that the upper alpha and faster on average than lower beta. And so if they weren't willing to live together at time t, they're not going to live together at t+1 unless there were an unusual set of shocks that made the children of the poorest beta very wealthy. But that's a probability less than one event. So with positive probability, permanent segregation occurs. Once you have that, you have the final result. With positive probability, there's an intergenerational Great Gatsby curve. And that is what happens is over time, if you looked at mean preserving spreads of income, as you spread out income, you slow down the rate of mobility because you exacerbate the gaps between the rich and the poor kids in terms of the quality of the human capital and the social influences they experience. Okay, so given there's a couple of minutes left, let me just turn to general discussion. So the vision I want you to have is you have these growing trajectories for families and they're aggregating themselves, agglomerating themselves into neighborhoods. Along the growing trajectories, you can, with positive probability, have permanent inequality. It's not guaranteed, but positive probability. So in other words, you would never know if you're in a poverty trap or an affluence trap ex ante. It's only ex post. It may be realized or not. And that's a different way to think about long run inequality dynamics. Okay, are there questions?
This is just a really straightforward one. Will you be sharing your slides?
Oh, of course, absolutely.
Great.
I will share slides and et cetera. So I'm sorry that I should have sent them in advance. That's called absent-minded professoritis.
No problem. Thank you.
So I was wondering, you briefly mentioned, I really like the way you sort of linked the Great Gatsby curve and to intergenerational mobility. And you were briefly commenting on inheritance versus human capital transmission. I was wondering whether you could maybe briefly elaborate more on how you would argue that inheritance fits into the story that you've been sort of explaining, and what the relative importance of inheritance will be as opposed to human capital.
Well, I'm not sure that there's a good measure of relative importance, and I think there's disagreements about it. You know that the Piketty work is claiming that inherited capital income is fundamental to persistence, and I think that there's quite. I've written critically about the work, so I'm not a neutral observer, so I think that I have misgivings about the strengths of his arguments. I also think there's pretty good evidence that there's heterogeneity between the European and American experiences. In other words, the inequalities in the U.S. are this explosion of the upper tail of wages. It's one thing to say you're inheriting land; it's another to say you're becoming a manager and making $1 billion a year. And so I think partly there's simply a distinction between those two contexts. I think that to build up inheritance in this model, what you would need to do is you would have to introduce, if you're introducing real estate or housing as a source of inheritance, I think would make the model, I more than think, I would say, I'm pretty confident, would make the model intractable. What might not make it intractable is if you said there's a thing called an aggregate production function, and there's some capital in the aggregate production function, and there's a savings mechanism for the parents outside of consumption. And so everybody owns some fraction of that share of the homogeneous capital good, and you can pass that on to your kids modulo a depreciation rate. That might be a way to build it. That all said, I do think in terms of inheritance, there is probably a sense in which, thinking about inheritance just through, holdings of things, my kids inherit money, is probably inadequate. I'll give you one example. It's under increasing criticism in the US is something called legacy admissions. And so Ivy League schools, one of the admissions criteria they use is whether your parents went there. I think that should be regarded as a part of inheritance. So I get a little bit of what I'm trying to say is I think outside the education thing, the things that are getting inherited are access to education, which isn't the same thing as the just is not private investment because it's a fact about the parents. I think that this issue of social connections and the like, that probably is pretty important, is something you inherit from parents. And so I don't want to dismiss inheritance as a factor, with the caveat that I think that there seems to be, in terms of understanding increasing inequality in the US versus Europe, the issue in the US is the shifts in the wage distribution. That seems to be more of a human capital story than an inheritance story. And as I said, I think you could introduce a homogeneous capital good, which is heritable. I just don't see how you could, at the end of the day, you don't want to run into writing down a model that's so elaborate there's no conclusions to draw. And in the housing market, I again haven't thought about it a fair amount. I don't see how it's doable.
Thank you very much.
I have a short question. In terms of mobility of income, the distinction between permanent and transitory income is clear. But in terms of income inequality, and just for the sake of measuring income inequality, what is like the best measure that you recommend or you think is to measure income inequality in terms of wages, or should we move towards wealth, or what is like, for example, the most appropriate measure that you think that we need to use for it?
Well, I think I want to say all of the above because it depends on the question. If you're asking about lifetime well-being, and since I'm not comfortable going into most dimensions of preference heterogeneity, I would, measures of lifetime wealth are appropriate. I think if you're asking about whether the economy is, what's happening in terms of flows, then wages are clearly a natural object to look at. Now, I think what's missing in all the measures, and this is true for the mobility, and I should have spent more time on this, is that they're summary measures or they're statistics that don't talk about mechanisms. So let me give you an example. Suppose that I said to you that, I'm going to make up a story, okay, that there was a perfect correlation, a perfect functional relationship between IQ and wages. It's not true. Let's suppose it's true. What does that tell me?
The smartest people are going to earn the most.
Well, it's not clear it even tells me that. What if I told you, oh, by the way, the entire GDP is Richard Feynman, who, when he was alive, was alleged to be, was a candidate for the smartest person. My point is that those mappings are underdetermine the actual stuff. Or put differently, the statement that a person's productivity affects their wages doesn't answer the question, are they being paid marginal products, or is this a monopsony? And what sort of bargaining is going on? And I think that in all of these measures, ultimately, their normative significance has to derive, or in many cases, much of the normative significance has to do for the reasons that you have these inequalities. I mean, let me give you a different example. Let's think about the civil service examinations, which is a merit-based assignment of jobs. In China, that was something that was being done in 700 in the Tang Dynasty. In the United Kingdom, that was that was considered a huge innovation in the second half of the 19th century. Everybody with me? Now, assume the following is true, and that is that the wages that somebody receives has something to do with their productivity. Everybody with me? If I have the assignment of the idiot children of the aristocracy to jobs, they don't have that much income, they're not that good at it. Once I have a meritocratic assignment, I'll have much bigger wage inequality. Okay, again, I mean fanciful, but I want you to see that if I moved from the assignment based on bloodline to jobs versus based on merit, on who would be most productive, I would have greater inequality in the second system than the first. I don't think anybody here is going to vote for the first as the more egalitarian system, because there, everything we would focus on is the mechanism. And so ultimately, I think what's missing in a lot of the discussion is they're just not, people aren't careful about the normative stuff. And, and to be clear, I'm not dismissing equality of outcomes. There's some dimensions where I think there's an absolute moral consensus on that. I've never heard a serious argument that people should be malnourished regardless of the reasons for their lack of income, or they shouldn't have access to some minimum level of medical care. These are no longer serious. I mean, they may have been argued in the 19th century. They're not serious arguments anymore. So certainly that would be one. Those are sets of dimensions where the outcomes are sufficient statistics for what you want to correct. But in many other cases, the reasons for the inequality seem to be essential. And so that's one of the frontiers in inequality and mobility measurement is trying to measure, for example, what fraction of intergenerational persistence is for factors people should be held responsible for. I don't think that there's an answer. I don't think there's compelling answers at this point, but that's a way you might want to formulate the question.
Great, thank you.
All right, so what I want to say is there's lots of opportunities for all of you guys. Okay, well, I've gone 10 minutes over time. I apologize. I will see some of you again in presentations. Otherwise, email me. Happy to talk. And thanks for listening.